Jake Morrison stood in the middle of what used to be Colony 7. The buildings around him were nothing but black metal and smoking concrete. The sky above was orange from the alien ships that hung there like giant crystal spiders. Each ship was bigger than a city block, and they had weapons that could turn a mountain into dust. The last evacuation shuttle had left 20 minutes ago. Jake watched it disappear into the clouds with his sister Katie and her twin girls aboard. He was supposed to be on that shuttle too, but someone had to stay behind. Someone had to make sure the aliens did not follow the fleeing humans. Someone had to buy them time to escape. His rifle was empty. He had thrown it away an hour ago when the last bullet left the barrel. His radio was dead. A piece of alien metal had cut through the wires during the bombardment. His body armor was cracked in 3 places and blood was slowly dripping from a cut on his forehead, but Jake was still standing. The Zephyrian ground troops were walking toward him now. They moved like robots in their shiny blue armor. Their weapons hummed with energy that could cut through steel like paper. Behind them came their commander in armor that was silver instead of blue. The alien was tall and thin with 4 arms, and eyes that glowed red in the dark. Jake reached down and pulled his combat knife from his belt. It was just a piece of steel with a black handle. Nothing special, nothing that could hurt aliens with energy shields and plasma guns. But it was all he had left besides the anger that was growing in his chest like a fire. The aliens stopped 50 feet away from him. They seemed confused. In their experience, humans always surrendered when they had no weapons left. They had been fighting humans for 3 years, and it always went the same way. Humans would shoot until they ran out of bullets. Then they would throw down their guns and beg for mercy. But Jake was not begging. He was not running. He was standing there with a knife in his hand and something in his eyes that made the aliens take a step back, even though they did not understand why. The alien commander spoke through a machine that turned his words into English. His voice sounded like metal scraping against stone. He told Jake to surrender and he would be allowed to live as a slave. The commander seemed to think this was generous. Jake looked at the knife in his hand and thought about his grandfather. Ryan Murphy had carried a knife just like this one in a war on Earth many years ago. His grandfather had told him stories about that war, about men who fought with nothing but their hands when their guns stopped working, about soldiers who died rather than give up, about humans who kept fighting even when fighting seemed impossible. The stories had seemed like ancient history when his grandfather told them, old tales from a time when humans fought other humans instead of aliens. But standing here with alien weapons pointed at him, Jake finally understood what his grandfather had been trying to teach him. Humans were different from other species, not because they were stronger or smarter or had better technology. Humans were different because they remembered things. They remembered every fight their ancestors had won. They remembered every time someone had said humans could not win and then proved them wrong. Jake thought about his sister Katie studying alien languages so humans and aliens could talk to each other instead of fighting. He thought about his nieces, who were only 6 years old and loved to draw pictures of spaceships. He thought about the 12,000 colonists who had lived here yesterday and were either dead or running for their lives today. The alien commander raised his weapon. The barrel began to glow with deadly energy. Around him, 30 other aliens did the same thing. They were going to turn Jake into ash and then chase down the evacuation shuttles to finish what they had started. But Jake was already moving, not away from the aliens, but toward them. The knife felt warm in his hand, and his grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in his ear. Sometimes running away is not an option. Sometimes you have to stand and fight even when you know you cannot win. Sometimes being human means choosing how you die. The aliens fired their weapons, but Jake was no longer standing where they expected him to be. 3 years of fighting had taught him how to read alien movements, how to see where they were aiming before they pulled the trigger, how to use the wreckage of human civilization as cover while he planned his next move. Jake Morrison had no weapons, except rage and memory. But as he disappeared into the smoke and ruins of Colony 7, the aliens began to realize that sometimes those were the most dangerous weapons of all. Jake ran through the burning streets like a ghost. The aliens were shooting at shadows and hitting nothing but broken concrete. Their energy weapons lit up the smoke, but Jake was always somewhere else by the time the light faded. He moved from building to building using doorways and holes in walls that the bombardment had created. The Zephyrians were good at fighting wars in space. Their ships could destroy planets and their computers could calculate the best way to win any battle. But they had never learned to fight the kind of war that humans had been fighting for thousands of years. The kind of war where you used rocks and sticks and anything else you could find. Jake picked up a piece of metal pipe from the rubble. It was heavy and sharp on one end where the explosion had torn it from a water main. Not much of a weapon against aliens with energy shields, but better than nothing. He had learned in the Marines that any object could be a weapon if you knew how to use it. Behind him he could hear the aliens talking to each other in their clicking language. They were frustrated. Their sensors were designed to track large groups of humans with metal equipment. One human hiding in ruins with nothing but a knife was almost invisible to their technology. Jake climbed through a hole in the wall of what used to be a school. The classroom was full of small desks and chairs scattered everywhere. Pictures that children had drawn were still hanging on the walls. Stick figures of families standing next to houses under yellow suns. Simple drawings of a time when the biggest worry was finishing homework. He thought about his nieces again. Lucy and Emma had attended this school before the war came to Colony 7. They had sat in desks like these, learning to read and write. They had drawn pictures just like the ones on the walls. Now they were somewhere in space, running from aliens who wanted to kill them for the crime of being human. The anger in Jake's chest grew hotter. The Zephyrians claimed they were fighting humans because humans were dangerous, because humans would eventually become a threat to galactic peace. But the only dangerous thing Jake could see was an alien army that murdered children to prevent a war that might happen someday. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Outside the classroom, heavy boots on broken glass. The aliens were searching the building room by room. Jake could hear them talking about the heat signatures their scanners were picking up. They knew he was in here somewhere. Jake looked around the classroom and found what he needed. The metal supports that held up the ceiling were loose from the bombardment. If he could pull the right one down, the whole section would collapse. It would not kill all the aliens, but it would slow them down and maybe take out a few. He climbed up on one of the desks and started working at the bolts that held the support beam in place. The metal was hot from the fires burning outside, but Jake ignored the pain. Pain was just information. His grandfather had taught him that too. Information that could be ignored when there were more important things to worry about. The aliens entered the classroom just as Jake loosened the last bolt. The ceiling beam came down like a giant hammer, crushing two of the aliens and blocking the doorway with tons of debris. The other aliens started shooting through the pile of metal and concrete, but Jake was already gone through another hole in the wall. He could hear them calling for help on their radios, asking for more troops to search the building, reporting that the human was using primitive tactics that their training had not prepared them for. Jake smiled as he listened. The aliens were learning that there was a difference between fighting humans with weapons and fighting humans without them. In the next building, Jake found an old kitchen. The gas lines were broken, and he could smell the leak. Gas was dangerous around the energy weapons the aliens carried. One shot in the wrong place and the whole building would explode. Jake started thinking about how he could use that. He found some cloth in a closet and soaked it with cooking oil from bottles that had survived the bombardment. Then he tied the cloth around pieces of broken glass and metal. Not exactly grenades, but close enough. If he could get the aliens to chase him into the right room at the right time, the gas would do the rest. Outside he could hear more aliens arriving. Vehicles with heavy engines and the whine of energy weapons charging up. They were bringing in the big guns to deal with one human with a knife. The idea would have been funny if Jake had time to think about it, but thinking was a luxury he could not afford. The aliens were learning to adapt to his tactics. Soon they would stop searching building by building and just blow up everything until nothing was left standing. He had to hurt them badly enough to make them call off the chase or find somewhere to make his last stand. Jake checked his watch. The evacuation shuttles had been gone for almost an hour now. Captain Rodriguez would be preparing to jump to faster than light speed to carry the survivors to safety. All he had to do was keep the aliens busy for another hour, and his sister and nieces would be beyond their reach. 1 hour 60 minutes. Against an entire alien army with nothing but rage and the memory of every human who had ever refused to give up when the odds were impossible. The explosion shook the entire building when the aliens walked into Jake's trap. The gas had been leaking for 10 minutes, and all it took was one energy blast to turn the kitchen into a bomb. 3 aliens were killed instantly, and 2 more were badly hurt. The rest of the squad fell back to regroup and call for backup. Jake used the confusion to move to a new position. He was learning to think like his ancestors who had hunted dangerous animals with nothing but sharp sticks and clever tactics. The key was to never fight fair. Never give the enemy what they expected. Always be somewhere else when they thought they knew where you were. From his new hiding spot in a collapsed garage, Jake could see the alien commander talking to his troops. The silver-armored leader was angry. His squad had been reduced from 30 soldiers to 25 by one human who should have been dead an hour ago. The commander was starting to realize that human beings were not like other species they had conquered. Most aliens surrendered when their technology failed. They accepted defeat as logical when victory became impossible. But humans had evolved differently. They came from a world where giving up meant death, and death was not acceptable as long as alternatives existed. Even alternatives that seemed crazy. Jake found a toolbox in the garage and started making new weapons. A hammer became a club. Screwdrivers became throwing knives. Wire became traps to tangle alien feet. Everything could be used to hurt enemies if you had the right mindset. The mindset of a species that had clawed its way to the top of the food chain by refusing to accept that anything was impossible. The aliens were moving more carefully now. They checked every room twice and used their scanners to look for heat signatures before entering buildings. But Jake had learned to use the fires burning everywhere to mask his body heat. He could move through the smoke like a shadow while their instruments showed them nothing but flames. He struck again at the edge of the colony, where the aliens had set up a communication post. Two guards with their backs to each other, thinking they were safe because their scanners showed no human life signs in the area. Jake came up from a storm drain that their sensors could not see into, and killed both guards with their own weapons before they knew he was there. The alien commander received the report of the dead guards, and finally understood what he was dealing with. This was not a standard military engagement. This was something older and more dangerous. This was a human being fighting the way humans had fought before they learned to use technology. Fighting the way they had fought when survival meant being willing to do anything necessary to stay alive. Jake took the alien communication device and started listening to their radio traffic. He could not understand most of what they were saying, but he recognized the tone. Fear. The aliens were afraid of him. Afraid of one human with primitive weapons who kept appearing where he was not supposed to be, and disappearing before they could stop him. The commander ordered his troops to fall back and establish a defensive perimeter. They would wait for reinforcements and heavy weapons before continuing the search. It was a smart tactical decision, but it told Jake everything he needed to know. The aliens were treating him like a serious threat instead of just another human to be eliminated. In the communications, he heard references to orbital bombardment. The aliens were considering destroying the entire colony from space rather than continue to hunt him on the ground. That would solve their immediate problem, but it would also prove something important. It would prove that humans could not be conquered easily even when they had no weapons left to fight with. Jake made his way toward the center of the colony where the government buildings had been. If the aliens were going to call down fire from their ships, he wanted to be somewhere that would hurt them when they did it. The Colonial Administration Center had been built over the main power plant. If the bombardment hit that facility, the explosion would damage any alien ships that were too close to the planet. He found the power plant still partially functional. Emergency systems were keeping the fusion reactor stable, but the control room was empty. Everyone had evacuated when the attack began. Jake started working with the controls, trying to remember his basic engineering training from the Marines. If he could overload the reactor at just the right moment, it would create an electromagnetic pulse that would disable any alien electronics in the area. Their ships would be temporarily blinded, and their ground forces would lose communication. It would not win the war, but it would send a message that humans were not as helpless as they seemed. The alien commander's voice came over the captured radio. He was reporting to his superiors that the human resistance was more effective than expected. He was requesting permission to use orbital weapons to eliminate the target. The response came back quickly. Permission granted. Jake looked at his watch. The evacuation shuttles had been gone for an hour and 15 minutes. They should be far enough away now to escape to faster than light speed. His sister and nieces were safe. The 12,000 other survivors were safe. His job was done. But Jake Morrison was not finished yet. He had learned something important during this fight. He had learned that humans carried inside them the memory of every battle their species had ever fought. Every victory won against impossible odds. Every last stand that turned defeat into legend. The aliens thought they understood humans because they had superior technology and bigger ships. But they had never met a human who remembered what his species was capable of when everything else was stripped away. The alien ships in orbit began charging their weapons. Jake could see the energy building up through the smoke and flames as the crystal holes started to glow. He had maybe 10 minutes before they turned the entire colony into a crater. 10 minutes. To make sure his death meant something more than just one more human casualty in a war that had already killed millions. Jake worked frantically with the power plant controls. The fusion reactor was designed with safety systems that prevented overloads, but every system had weaknesses if you knew where to look. He started bypassing the automatic shutoffs one by one while the reactor's output climbed toward dangerous levels. Outside, he could hear the aliens moving closer. The commander had decided to risk sending his troops in for one final assault before the orbital bombardment began. They wanted to confirm the human was dead before they withdrew to a safe distance. It was a reasonable precaution that would turn out to be their biggest mistake. Jake sealed himself inside the reactor control room and activated the emergency lockdown. The aliens would need heavy weapons to break through the reinforced door, and he could hear them setting up outside. But they were too close to the reactor when it exploded, and too far from their ships to escape what was coming next. The first energy beam from orbit hit the administration building directly above the power plant. The aliens had aimed for what their scanners showed as the largest concentration of human technology, hoping to destroy whatever equipment Jake was using. Instead, they hit the exact spot that would cause the most damage to themselves. The fusion reactor overloaded in a chain reaction that turned the entire power plant into a miniature sun for exactly 3 seconds. The electromagnetic pulse that followed knocked out every piece of alien electronics within 50 miles. Their ships lost power and started falling toward the planet. Their troops on the ground lost communication and their weapons stopped working. Jake Morrison died in the explosion, but his final act created something unexpected. The alien commander and his remaining troops found themselves stranded on a hostile planet with no way to contact their fleet. Their energy weapons were dead and their vehicles would not start. For the first time in the war, the aliens were forced to fight humans with nothing but primitive tools and hand-to-hand combat. The irony was not lost on the alien commander as he picked up a piece of metal pipe to use as a club. His troops had never trained for combat without technology because they had never expected to need such skills. But humans had been fighting without technology for thousands of years before they ever left their home planet. Within hours, human resistance fighters began arriving from other colonies. They had monitored the electromagnetic pulse and realized what had happened here was a chance to capture alien technology and maybe some prisoners for interrogation. But more importantly, here was proof that humans could fight aliens on equal terms when technology was removed from the equation. Captain Elena Rodriguez received the reports from her flagship as it jumped to faster than light speed, carrying the survivors of Colony 7. The electromagnetic pulse had been detected by sensors across 3 star systems. Every human military unit in the sector was converging on the colony to see what had caused such a massive energy release. But what they found was a battlefield where the rules had changed completely. Alien soldiers with 4 arms and superior strength were losing fights to humans who used tactics learned from studying Earth's military history. Humans who remembered how their ancestors had defeated enemies that seemed impossible to beat. The alien commander tried to establish order among his panicking troops, but they had never encountered an enemy like this. An enemy that seemed to grow more dangerous the more desperate the situation became. An enemy that treated impossible odds as just another problem to be solved through superior tactics and unbreakable will. Jake Morrison's sister Katie learned about his death 3 days later when the rescue ships reached the Colony 7 survivors. She cried for her brother, but she also felt something else. Pride. Jake had died the way he lived, fighting for people he loved and refusing to give up even when giving up was the logical choice. The recordings of Jake's final battle spread through human space faster than official reports. Every human colony received copies of the surveillance footage showing one Marine with a knife destroying an entire alien battalion. The psychological effect was immediate and overwhelming. Human resistance fighters who had been hiding in caves and fighting guerrilla campaigns suddenly became bold. Human fleet commanders who had been retreating from superior alien forces began planning counterattacks. Human civilians who had been accepting defeat as inevitable started building weapons and organizing militias. Jake Morrison had proven something that changed the entire war. He had proven that humans were at their most dangerous when they had nothing left to lose. That human beings carried within them the accumulated fighting experience of every warrior who had ever lived. That memory was a weapon more powerful than any technology when it was combined with absolute determination. The aliens had made a critical error in their assessment of human psychology. They had assumed that humans fought best when they had superior equipment and safe positions. They had never considered that humans might fight better when they had nothing but desperation and the memory of every ancestor who had faced extinction and refused to accept it. The war was far from over, but something fundamental had changed. The aliens could no longer assume that disarmed humans were helpless humans. They could no longer count on human surrender when human weapons failed. They had learned too late that the most dangerous human was not one with a gun but one with nothing left to lose except the memory of what it meant to be human. 6 months after Jake Morrison died at Colony 7, the war had become something completely different. Human forces were no longer retreating from superior alien technology. Instead, they were using tactics that made no sense to alien commanders, who had studied warfare for centuries but had never encountered an enemy that refused to follow logical patterns. Captain Elena Rodriguez had been promoted to admiral after her successful evacuation of Colony 7 survivors. She now commanded a fleet of 40 ships tasked with retaking human colonies that had been captured by the Zephyrians. But her most important weapon was not any of her ships or their advanced weapons. It was the story of Jake Morrison and what one human could accomplish with nothing but determination. The recordings of Jake's final battle had been broadcast to every human military unit in known space, but they had also been captured by alien intelligence services and studied by Zephyrian commanders trying to understand what had gone wrong at Colony 7. The aliens were beginning to realize they had seriously underestimated the species they were trying to exterminate. Admiral Rodriguez stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching the planet below where 20,000 human colonists were being held as slaves by Zephyrian occupation forces. According to intelligence reports, the aliens had taken away all human weapons and destroyed all human technology. They thought this made the humans helpless. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The rescue operation began with a simple message broadcast to the planet on frequencies the aliens could not detect. The message contained detailed instructions for making weapons from common household items, how to build explosive devices from cleaning supplies, how to fashion knives from kitchen utensils, how to turn any building into a fortress using furniture, and determination. But more importantly, the message contained the story of Jake Morrison. How one Marine with nothing but a combat knife had held off an entire alien army long enough for 12,000 people to escape. How he had proven that humans were never truly helpless as long as they remembered who they were and where they came from. The effect on the human slaves was immediate. Within hours, small groups began attacking alien guards using improvised weapons and tactics copied from Jake's example. The aliens found themselves fighting an enemy that appeared to be everywhere at once and nowhere when they tried to strike back. Dr. Lisa Parker had spent the last 6 months studying what she called the Morrison effect. Human soldiers across the galaxy were demonstrating abilities that seemed to go beyond normal training or experience. They were accessing what appeared to be genetic memories of combat techniques their ancestors had used thousands of years earlier. The phenomenon was most pronounced in situations where humans had lost their advanced weapons and were forced to fight with primitive tools. Under those conditions, humans began displaying tactical awareness and fighting skills that their formal training could not account for. They were remembering things they had never learned about warfare that was older than civilization. On the planet below Admiral Rodriguez's fleet, the human uprising was spreading faster than the aliens could contain it. Groups of slaves were using tactics that seemed to come from nowhere, ambush techniques that resembled ancient hunting strategies, psychological warfare methods that had been developed by primitive tribes fighting for survival against superior enemies. The alien commander on the planet sent increasingly desperate reports to his superiors. The humans were not fighting like a conquered population. They were fighting like a species that had never learned the concept of surrender. Every time his forces eliminated one group of rebels, 2 more groups appeared somewhere else using completely different tactics. Admiral Rodriguez received permission to begin the ground assault when alien defenses started to collapse from internal pressure. Her Marines landed expecting to fight a conventional battle against fortified positions. Instead, they found themselves joining a planet-wide revolution where 20,000 humans with improvised weapons were systematically destroying an occupation force that outnumbered them 3 to 1. The key to human success was not superior firepower or better strategy. It was the simple fact that humans treated every fight as if the survival of their entire species depended on the outcome. They fought with an intensity that alien psychology could not comprehend because aliens had never evolved on a planet where everything was trying to kill them. Jake Morrison's combat knife had been recovered from the ruins of Colony 7 and was now carried by Admiral Rodriguez as a symbol of what humans could accomplish when they refused to give up. She brought the knife with her when she landed on the liberated planet to meet with the resistance leaders who had organized the uprising. The resistance commander was a woman named Beth Cooper, who had been a school teacher before the war. She had organized her students' parents into fighting units using tactics she learned from studying the Morrison recordings. Her fighters had captured alien weapons and vehicles, but they still preferred to use the improvised tools they had built themselves. Beth told Admiral Rodriguez that the aliens had made one critical mistake in their occupation strategy, tried to break human morale by taking away human technology. But humans had never needed technology to be dangerous. They had survived ice ages and natural disasters and predators that were faster and stronger by using their brains and their absolute refusal to accept extinction. The liberation of the planet took only 3 days once the human fleet arrived. The aliens surrendered not because they were outnumbered, but because they finally understood what they were fighting. They were fighting a species that had evolved to survive against impossible odds, a species that got more dangerous the more desperate their situation became. News of the victory spread through both human and alien space. For humans, it was proof that Jake Morrison's sacrifice had meaning beyond one man's heroic death. For aliens, it was a warning that exterminating humanity would be far more difficult and costly than anyone had imagined. Admiral Rodriguez established a memorial to Jake Morrison in the center of the liberated colony, but she also used the ceremony to broadcast a message to every Zephyrian commander in the galaxy. Humans were offering one chance for peace. The aliens could withdraw to their original borders and the war would end. But if they chose to continue fighting, they would be facing an enemy that carried the memory of every struggle in human history. The response to Admiral Rodriguez's peace offer came from an unexpected source. Commander Yalara was the daughter of General Vegstar, who had died fighting Jake Morrison at Colony 7. She had watched the recordings of her father's final battle and seen something that changed her understanding of the war her people were fighting. Yalara addressed the human fleet not as an enemy but as a soldier who had witnessed what humans were capable of when everything they loved was threatened. She spoke of watching Jake Morrison destroy her father's battalion with nothing but a knife and the determination to protect his family. She said her people had never encountered anything like human ferocity in their centuries of galactic conquest. The Zephyrian Empire had built their civilization on the belief that superior technology would always defeat inferior weapons. They conquered species by demonstrating overwhelming force until resistance became illogical. But humans had proven that some things mattered more than logic. Some things were worth fighting for, even when victory was impossible. Admiral Rodriguez received Commander Yalara's transmission while orbiting Colony 7, where Jake Morrison had made his last stand. The colony had been rebuilt, but the memorial to Jake still stood in the exact spot where he had died. His combat knife was embedded in a block of metal taken from the alien command post he had destroyed. The peace negotiations took place on Colony 7 because both sides agreed it was fitting. The place where one human had changed the course of the war should be where that war finally ended. Katie Morrison attended the talks as the chief human representative. She carried her brother's knife not as a weapon, but as a reminder of what had been sacrificed to reach this moment. Commander Yalara explained why her people had believed extermination was their only option when dealing with humanity. Humans were different from every other species the Zephyrians had encountered. Most civilizations became peaceful once they developed advanced technology. They lost their aggressive instincts because violence was no longer necessary for survival, but humans had retained their fighting spirit even after leaving their home planet. They treated every conflict as if they were still primitive hunters defending their tribes against extinction. This made them unpredictable and dangerous in ways that Zephyrian strategists could not calculate or prepare for. The negotiations lasted for weeks as both sides worked to understand how such different species could coexist peacefully. The breakthrough came when Katie Morrison shared recordings of Jake's final radio transmission. In his last moments, her brother had not spoken of hatred or revenge. He had spoken of protecting the people he loved and hoping that someday humans and aliens could find a better way to resolve their differences. The peace treaty that emerged from the negotiations was unlike any agreement in galactic history. Instead of simple territorial boundaries, it included provisions for cultural exchange and mutual education. Humans would teach aliens about their history and the experiences that had shaped their psychology. Aliens would help humans understand why other species feared human unpredictability. Admiral Rodriguez signed the treaty using Jake Morrison's combat knife as a pen. The symbolism was intentional. The weapon that had ended so many alien lives was now being used to create the document that would save millions of lives on both sides. War was ending not through conquest but through understanding. The treaty established exchange programs where young humans would live among alien civilizations, to learn their cultures and values. Young aliens would come to human worlds to study human history and understand why humans fought the way they did. Both species would work together to ensure that fear and misunderstanding never again led to genocide or war. Katie Morrison became the first human ambassador to the Zephyrian Empire. She established schools where alien children learned about human heroes like her brother who had died protecting others. She also created programs where human children learned about alien perspectives and the reasons why different species sometimes feared each other. The memorial to Jake Morrison on Colony 7 became a pilgrimage site for both humans and aliens. Humans came to remember that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they refused to give up. Aliens came to understand that humans were dangerous, not because they were naturally violent, but because they would do anything to protect what they loved. Years passed and the story of Jake Morrison spread beyond human and Zephyrian space to become known throughout the galaxy. It became a legend shared by dozens of species about the importance of understanding your enemies before you try to destroy them, about the power of memory to transform ordinary individuals into something greater when everything they care about is threatened. The human memorial on Colony 7 bears a simple inscription that both species helped to write. It says that Lieutenant Jake Morrison had no weapons but rage and memory, and that those were enough to change the course of history. But it also says that the greatest victory was not his last battle but the peace that came after it. Children of both species now learn the story of Jake Morrison as a reminder that war should always be the last option, and that understanding between different peoples is possible, even after the worst conflicts. They learn that humans and aliens are not so different when it comes to protecting their families and hoping for a better future for their children. The war that began with mutual fear and misunderstanding ended with mutual respect and cooperation. Jake Morrison died believing he was buying time for his family to escape. He never knew that his sacrifice would eventually save both species from a war that could have destroyed them all. His memory became the foundation for a peace that lasted for generations and proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the willingness to die for something greater than yourself.